Oh, that was the entirety of his post-fight interview. He said, John Anik went up to him. So you came in here, you got the big knockout. What do you have to say? And DeKiriko took the mic, said,
"Scusi, babbity booby."
And that was it. So
that's awesome.
Anik brought the mic to his translator, who told him,
"Can't translate that."
Okay.
I can't translate that. So that was a fun exchange. And then I think we have some questions because we put out the call a couple weeks ago. My goodness, dude. You all right? Was that in honor of the fact that we have 420 patrons? I just realized. Nice. Hello, and welcome to Heavy Hands. I am your host, Connor Ruebusch. With me is Dr. Patrick Wyman, as always. And today we are going to be recapping some of the events of UFC Winnipeg, which I realize already I should have just called UFC Lawler versus Dos Anjos. A lot of momentous events took place on this card, not the least of which was Rafael Dos Anjos' dominant victory over Robbie Lawler in the main event. We're going to talk about that and more. And then at the end of today's show, we're going to have a little discussion on the fine art of matchmaking as it pertains to both this card, next week's card, and basically all the cards we've been talking to you about this year. So we are going to get into all of that, starting off with Lawler versus Dos Anjos. Pat, we both ended up siding with Robbie Lawler last week. How do you feel about that decision now?
I think this was maybe one that we should have seen aspects of coming, and then there were other pieces of it that maybe we couldn't have seen coming. I think leaving aside the fact that Lawler very obviously hurt his knee in what was that, like the third or the fourth round?
Third round. Like by the end of the third, I believe he had hurt his knee.
His knee was hurt. So, you never want to count out fourth and fifth round Robbie Lawler, but even by the time that injury happened, which pretty well destroyed his chances of coming back and winning the fight, it was fairly clear to me, at least, that Lawler has lost another step, like compared to the guy who fought Cowboy Cerrone back even in July, definitely compared to the guy who fought Rory McDonald 2.5 years ago now, and the guy who beat Johnny Hendricks. Like he's just not the same guy, and that's okay. Like, but it seems like he may finally have hit that point on the aging curve where he's not going to be competitive with the very elite of the elite anymore.
Friend of the show, Phil McKenzie, had an interesting theory on Twitter. I don't know if you saw this, but he posited that Lawler Cerrone may have been one of those rare but perfect matchups in which both men are declining at just the right rate, that they can still be very competitive and exciting together. And yet maybe both of them are a little worse off than we realized because we came into that fight with so many assumptions about how good both of them still were. It was
such an objectively good fight too. Like
yeah. But it is worth remembering. Like there were like 2 or 3 losses for Cerrone around the time of that fight. He got stopped by Darren Till shortly after. Robbie Lawler, that was his only fight in the midst of a long layoff. And before that, knockout loss to Tyron Woodley. Afterwards, looks a little flat against Rafael Dos Anjos. I don't know. There's something to it, maybe, that perhaps we just didn't realize that Robbie Lawler is declining. What in this fight gave you the impression that he is declining, though? I'm interested to know.
Real trouble pulling the trigger, especially early in the fight. Like he really, it seemed, had trouble gathering acting on the information he was gathering. Like he was very clearly gathering information in the first round and into the second. He was very clearly gathering information, figuring out, okay, what are the shots that Dos Anjos is going to respond to? What's his footwork like? What's his range? He was doing the Robbie Lawler thing that we see Robbie Lawler do all the time, where he's picking up on trends and he's going to turn that into actionable information for him to pick and choose his shots and when he's going to explode. It just seemed like he had a lot harder time actually acting on it
Mm-hmm.
once he did it. Like you could see the wheels turning in Lawler's head the same way you could always see the wheels turning in Lawler's head. It just seemed like once it came time to actually do something with that, it was a little harder. He still did it. It's not like he's completely shot or anything like that. It was just noticeably harder for him to pick and choose his spots. It seemed to me at least.
How much of that, though, had to do with the well-rounded and arguably perfect approach of Rafael Dos Anjos? There was not a single range or phase in which he did not have several things to offer Robbie Lawler. And I think that was part of the difficulty, is that Robbie, being one of those fighters who's a great adapter, you can overload the computer a bit at times. You can give him a little too much information to process. He had a hard time from the beginning of this fight catching up to the adjustments of Dos Anjos, because Dos Anjos, it just felt like had a readier grasp of the full range of things he could do. When Robbie would come forward after eating some punches in a flurry, that's when Dos Anjos would make him chase for a bit, maybe take some of the fire out of him so he couldn't get that immediate rally, and then he'd kick him low on the calf. And then he would step into the clinch and tie him up. There was always some way for Dos Anjos to respond that did not necessarily involve him just standing on the end of Robbie's punches. Mm-hmm. Robbie seemed to have a hard time keeping up with that. And I think we have to give some credit to RDA for that.
That is absolutely true, and I want to talk more about that in a second. I just want to point out that there were times where the younger version of Lawler would have pulled the trigger.
Yeah,
so there were a couple of points when Dos Anjos was backed up to the fence and he was kind of shelled up, where a younger Lawler would have mixed up his shots to the head and body. He would have found a way around the guard, where he just would have thrown. Yeah. He just would have thrown shots, where in this fight he maybe threw one, or he didn't throw at all.
There were a few moments where Dos Anjos would get backed up and he would be in this very dicey, awkward position where he was like squared up, trying to hook his left. Trying to hook his left hand over the top as Lawler was punching him. And I did think, like, a younger Robbie Lawler probably would uppercut his chin off in this scenario.
Those are the ones I'm talking about. Yeah. But yeah, I don't want to focus too much on Lawler, because I think that, like, he looked more or less like himself, just a little older. Mm-hmm. And then there was the knee injury. And you never know, like, 4th and 5th round Lawler, if he hadn't gotten hurt, could very well have come out and just fucking flattened Dos Anjos.
Yeah, now we know that's the solution to avoid 5th round Lawler. You just have to break his knee first.
Yeah. I mean, but I think in terms of something that we should have seen coming, you were right about the clinch and I was wrong. I'm fine admitting that, even if over the course of the fight, the clinch looked more like I thought it would. But especially at first, Lawler got beat the fuck up inside the clinch. I did not expect that.
I was not even, I didn't immediately think when I saw Dos Anjos having success in the clinch, God damn that Pat, he led me astray, because that's what happened in the Matt Brown fight too. Matt Brown got in really good licks early in the clinch, and then Lawler adjusted. And that same thing did happen in this fight. A lot of people are talking about how well Dos Anjos did in the clinch, but it's worth remembering, like, in the 2nd and 3rd rounds, Lawler spent a lot of time clinching Dos Anjos up against the fence and landing some good knees and body punches from that position. He did neutralize a lot of what Dos Anjos was doing, so the clinch became more of a fallback than a go-to tactic in the later rounds.
Yeah, I don't want to overstate it, but especially early, I was kind of surprised at how much damage Dos Anjos was able to do there, especially considering how dominant Lawler was in the clinch early against Cerrone.
Right. Yeah. Good point.
That was kind of surprising to me. So, but yeah, I mean, I think that this has answered all questions about Dos Anjos' strength, given how strong we know Lawler is. Maybe a little worrisome for Dos Anjos moving forward that Lawler was able to control him against the fence for such large stretches. Mm-hmm. But that's something else. I mean, so I think you're absolutely right, Connor, in wanting to put the emphasis on how good Dos Anjos was here, because he was. He looked much improved, even compared to his last couple of fights. Like, he just keeps looking better and better and better and better in every outing, despite the fact that he's now 33 years old. He's been a pro fighter for 13 years. He's still making improvements every time out. That is stunning.
Yeah, because he thinks about the fight game like a goddamn pro. Like, that's the thing about Dos Anjos. He's boring to listen to. He doesn't seem to have much of a personality that comes through in his interviews. He's not like, he's definitely dangerous enough to hurt people, but he's still not much of a finisher. Like, I understand why people wouldn't necessarily latch on to Dos Anjos as a star fighter, but he is a fucking pro. if you were to worry about a fighter leaving their longtime coach, as Dos Anjos did with Rafael Cordero, like Dos Anjos is doing shit the right way. He brought in Jason Perillo. He's like building a team that is all about making sure he is as well prepared as he can possibly be for his next opponent.
He was also working with, it looked like to me, I think he was working with Alex Chadud, who's a Muay Thai coach, a kickboxing coach out of Brazil.
Chadud worked with Aldo, right?
Yeah, he worked with Aldo. He worked with Aldo back in the day. He's a really sharp coach. You could, if you follow him on Instagram, you can see some of the drills he works. He's a sharp dude. He's pretty meat and potatoes, but very solid technical with things like footwork and combination work. More or less exactly what we saw from Dos Anjos here. So you're absolutely right, Connor, because Dos Anjos is growing. He's growing the right way. He's identifying weaknesses in his game, things that he wants to work on, and finding the right coaches to help him work on those things, to help him improve those things.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. People talked to us last week. I don't know how much of this you got. I got a few comments. People saying, "Yeah, but what about the fact that Dos Anjos is working with Perillo, with Jason Perillo, who listeners of the show will know you and I are both big fans of. We both
we think very highly of him.
Yeah, we both have a ton of respect for what he's done with fighters like Cyborg, who's fighting in a couple weeks, and Michael Bisping, and of course he worked with BJ Penn way back in the day when Penn was regarded as one of the best boxers in MMA. And I was I had some trepidation about how much improvement Dos Anjos might be able to make over a relatively short period of time, especially because the man, this is his third fight in 6 months. He's been spending more time fighting than just training, it seems, but the improvements were there. Like, Jason Perillo worked his magic once again, and credit to Rafael Dos Anjos for opening the door for Perillo to do that. Dos Anjos is a pressure fighter. We know that. And we know from many of his losses that he has a bit of a weakness to people who he cannot effectively pressure, whatever the reason may be. This was his best anti-pressure performance yet, I think. The little glimmers of like defensive jabs and footwork that we saw in his fight with Tony Ferguson, the stuff that allowed him to go the distance and compete despite losing most of the later rounds, that was better in this fight. There were the thing that really stood out to me, aside from the brief moments where he did get squared up and try those ugly defensively open counters that we mentioned, Dos Anjos was quite difficult to back into the cage. He didn't end up in that Anthony Pettis, both feet lined up against the fence position very often because he pivoted away from it. He kept, if you move backwards toward the fence, right, your back foot's going to hit first, and the only way to continue retreating is to move your front foot back until both feet are parallel with each other. And instead of that, when Dos Anjos felt his right foot hitting the fence, he turned and then got a little more space behind his right foot. And then if Lawler cut him off, he would turn the other way and get a little more space on the other side and use the angles of the octagon to his advantage to not be cornered. It was really only when Lawler was tying him up that Dos Anjos spent a lot of time against the fence. I don't know, man. His defense, his combination punching, that flurry he threw against Robbie Lawler, the like 25-second flurry of death. How the fuck did he do that? How do you do that?
He is still, this is something else that's worth bearing in mind. He's still really fast.
Oh, hell yeah.
His hand speed. Been quick, but he's got quick hands. He's got quick feet. He's explosive. Like, he's still really, and even at his age, like, it's all this stuff with him. And I think in large part, this comes back to him being just a boring person. Like, that he just does the right shit every day. Like, which is not a thing that you can take for granted when it comes to a sport like MMA, is that other sports make it easy to be professional because you are surrounded every day by team structures. You know, like, you have agents who are telling you of the right ways to do things. You have a team nutritionist. You have a team strength and conditioning coach. You have teammates. You have huge financial incentives, like way out of the realm of anything that you see in MMA, to stick to the straight and narrow, to stick to your diet, to show up to your strength and conditioning programs, to show up to your practices. MMA does not have that. It is much harder to be a lunch pail pro in a sport where you don't have those kinds of peer pressures on you. So the guys who tend to succeed at the very highest levels in MMA, even more so than other sports, tend to be guys who are insane self-starters and are insanely disciplined.
Yeah,
and
that comes through, dude.
Yeah, and Dos Anjos is just one of those dudes. Like, and I think that's why, despite his age, despite the mileage that he has on him, because like a lot of his fights have not been easy fights. It's not like he doesn't get hit. Like the dude is just durable and gets up every day and does the right shit and eats right and does his strength and conditioning and does his training sessions and thinks hard about what's going to be most beneficial to him. Like it is really, really, really hard to do that over a long period of time. And he's
smart in the cage too. Like he gets hit, but he doesn't tend to get hit by the same shot twice in a row. You know, he is an adaptable fighter. He's got a lot of versatility to what he does. I don't know. I maybe that's not something you would normally think of for someone who has just been described as lunch pail, which I love now that we've identified Rafael Dos Anjos as the true blue collar workman-like MMA fighter. It's the truth.
He really is.
Yeah,
but like,
he is.
And you know, one of the things I think he realized maybe that his defense was a little predictable, and that's part of the reason why working with somebody like Carrillo has been beneficial for him, is because his defense in this fight looked way better. It was way more organic. He did a way better job of seeing shots coming in and adapting his defense, as opposed to just kind of knowing what the right thing to do after throwing a particular shot is. Like you pointed out last week, he did a way better job of moving his head in unpredictable ways, of not falling into a rhythm with his defense, into a predictable rhythm. Like this was a fucking brilliant performance from him. He deserves all the credit in the world. And he's going to like nobody in 2014 would have thought, oh yeah, Rafael Dos Anjos going to go down as an all-time great fighter. He should, at this point, after this run, he has a strong case to be made that he is an all-time great fighter.
Yeah, it's hard to disagree with that. This is Rafael Dos Anjos now, the guy who got knocked out by a fringe featherweight early in his UFC career, a current fringe top 10 featherweight, is now really making a strong case for the welterweight championship. And not only that, instead of getting knocked out by Jeremy Stevens, he's in there in the pocket with Robbie Lawler, hiding behind his shoulder, changing up the tempo of his combinations, and keeping the ruthless one pinned to the fence with his punches for 20 to 30 seconds at a stretch. Like, it's hard to understate how impressive Rafael Dos Anjos' growth continues to be. And we should praise the man for that, because he looked hella good. Speaking of the welterweight title, before we move on to any other fights from this card, we have to talk about Dos Anjos now as a top contender for Tyron Woodley's belt. He has said, as I think once again showing his professionalism and his smart attitude regarding the fight game, he's willing to wait for the title shot while Tyron Woodley gets his shoulder operated on. I think that's the right move, because he seems like he really deserves the fight. How do you think the matchup will play out?
I think that Dos Anjos is a really, really bad matchup for Woodley. If Woodley fights him the way that he has fought his last few fights, where he lets his opponent back him up to the cage and then uses either the threat of his wrestling or the threat of the big right hand to scare his opponents off, you cannot scare Dos Anjos off. He is aware of what the risks are when he fights the way that he wants to fight, which generally involves pressure, and he does it anyway. You can't stop him from pulling the trigger by scaring him off the way that Woodley could scare off Stephen Thompson or Damian Maia eventually. You just can't frighten him. He's going to throw the shots that he wants to throw. He's aware of the risk of the right hand that's going to come back afterwards, and then he's going to counter your counter. Like, that's fine with him. He doesn't fight like a guy who can be scared off of his process, and that is what makes him really tough. Now, the worrisome thing is that if you look at the thread that ties together not Dos Anjos' knockout losses, but his other losses, it's that he gets ground out by a bigger, stronger wrestler. So I think that's what happened to him against Khabib. That happened to him in a really odd fight that nobody ever really talks about with Gleison Tibau a few years back. Like, that's easily the most inexplicable loss of Dos Anjos' career.
Yeah.
But the
and right before the start of his first really great run as a lightweight contender.
Yeah. It's just like he gets tied up and controlled by a bigger, stronger guy. And Woodley is really big and really strong. So could Woodley just grind him out if he doesn't finish him with a single big shot? Entirely possible.
The thing is that I don't 100% agree with the phrase Dos Anjos is a terrible matchup for Tyron Woodley, but I absolutely understand where you're coming from, because the thing is that Tyron Woodley has a difficult decision to make in how he approaches Rafael Dos Anjos. If he decides to grind him out, what happens if that exhausts him to the point of not having his full power, of not having his full speed, and then he's still got the 4th and 5th rounds left? Even if he gets 3 rounds with lots of top control and using his size and strength to wrestle Dos Anjos, I don't believe that's enough to sap Dos Anjos' conditioning. It may be enough to sap Tyron's conditioning. It may leave him in a very difficult position with a fighter who still feels capable of putting the pressure on him, only now he can stuff the takedowns because they don't have the same drive behind them.
That's true, but that's why I don't think I think Woodley could kind of clinch him against the cage all day without really losing too much. Where I think Woodley could burn himself out is going for takedowns. Like if Woodley shoots really big explosive doubles in open space, but we know Woodley is a smart fighter, and Woodley is a well-trained fighter. There's no way Woodley is going to do stupid shit like blast a double from halfway across the octagon and rely on his explosiveness to take Dos Anjos down. I think he would probably let himself back up toward the fence, let Dos Anjos commit to a combination, then try to grab a leg as Dos Anjos throws one of his patented low kicks, and either take him down off that caught kick or just spin him around into the fence and hold him there and see how long the ref will let you do it. If the ref will let you do it for 2 minutes, you burn up 2 minutes. Mm-hmm. And like if Woodley can burn up 3 minutes of every round with something like that, then Woodley can, with activity that for him, because he's so strong, is not going to really wear him out. He can fight the other 2 minutes of those rounds at a pace higher than one he would normally prefer, I think. That's what that game plan would look like if I were doing it. And I think that's probably what Dean Thomas and Woodley's camp would be thinking.
Yeah, and they replied to you on Twitter. I'm sure you saw that. Dean Thomas said, "Don't worry, we got it handled, Playboy," or something like that.
He did, yeah.
Which I respect.
Which I love.
Yeah.
I love Dean Thomas, man. Like I got nothing but respect for them. I got nothing but respect for how they do it. Like if Woodley won that, but I stand by my thought, which is that Dos Anjos is a bad matchup because you can't scare him off.
Yeah, and it's not like, again, even Robbie Lawler holding Dos Anjos against the fence, he didn't just get to rest. Dos Anjos was still trying to work. He was still trying to find openings for elbows. He was still landing knees to the body. Like even if Woodley were to have several successful minutes or rounds of that, Dos Anjos is still going to be there. That is part of what makes him a particularly dangerous opponent for Woodley, is that Dos Anjos is probably has good reason to be less scared of gassing than almost anyone Woodley's ever fought. The guy just doesn't slow down. The way he threw like 50 power punches in a row against Robbie Lawler, intelligently placed a lot of them to the body. I think that had something to do with the fact that Lawler wasn't able to come back and punish him, and then was so recovered by the end of the round that he could do the same kind of thing again in the next round and the next one and the next one. Like the man just doesn't get tired, especially if he's pressuring you. And that's the thing. If Woodley does not go for those tie-ups, if he tries to rely on the fact that he can really surprise people by just placing a lightning quick right hand down the middle as they come in, then yeah, that's going to be dangerous for Dos Anjos. Yes, that has some echoes of his fight with Eddie Alvarez, but after the first 3 or 4 don't work, Dos Anjos is going to get harder and harder to hit with that same shot. And there's not enough variety to Woodley's striking when he's being pressured that Dos Anjos can't read that stuff eventually. So really, like, if Dos Anjos gets out of the first round and hasn't spent much of it being clinched against the fence, there's good reason to believe the next 4 rounds are going to be pretty good for him.
I mean, I will tell you right now, I would pick Dos Anjos in that fight. But if Woodley won the way that we've outlined, that would in no way, shape, or form be surprising to me. Because we've talked about this before, but Woodley does not get enough credit for how smart he is and how well-trained he is. Like the fact that Woodley's style may not always be aesthetically appealing does not mean that he is not putting himself in the best position to win fights. Yeah. Like and we've talked about how he, maybe he would benefit from taking a little, in the grand scheme of things, from being a little less risk averse. But you can't knock the results really, of Woodley's run as champion. So I think if anybody who is I think at a stylistic disadvantage, the way that Woodley is going to beat Dos Anjos, it would be Woodley.
Yeah. But if anybody's going to beat Woodley, like Dos Anjos seems like a fairly good candidate. So I'm on board for that, man. I'm excited for the Dos Anjos title run. And if he wins the welterweight title now, Pat, there will be no doubt that he belongs in the pound-for-pound great column. Like, he belongs in that discussion. So let's move on, and we're going to take a quick break to do that. When we come back, we're going to talk about Santiago Ponzinibbio's win over Mike Perry in what was, as expected, a fun barn burner to watch, along with some of the other fights from the Lawler versus Dos Anjos undercard. And then we will move on with the rest of the show after this. Hey, everybody. Thanks for listening to this week's Heavy Hands. If you like what you hear, please consider pledging to support the podcast on Patreon. Patreon is basically continuous crowdfunding. You sign up to contribute a certain amount per month to help us with production costs and the like, and in return you get rewards ranging from a mention on the Heavy Hands website to a question or topic of your choice being discussed on the show. We have a lot more in the works to reward you for your help, and we appreciate every contribution. No amount is too small. Just head over to patreon.com and find how you can help out the only show dedicated to the finer points of face punching. Now let's get back to it. And we are back. This is Heavy Hands. We're going to talk about the welterweight fight between Santiago Ponzinibbio and Mike Perry. We expected this one to be a wild and crazy war, and it absolutely was. I don't know why I said it like that, Pat. I can't explain myself. It was a war. It was a tactical war. It was a delight to experience, just like all Mike Perry fights. First things first, I totally see what you're saying after watching this fight. More than I did last week when I agree with you, Mike Perry, a fighter with tremendous potential. The dude is getting better even as he keeps like running up against guys he can't quite beat just yet. And it's evident that he is rapidly turning into a very, very dangerous man to fight.
Yeah, if you look at Mike Perry's performances, if you look at his first couple of fights in the UFC, you look at the fight with Ellenberger, you look at the fight with Reyes, you look at this fight, and you say, oh, it's the same dude. Like, it's not like there is a subjective thing here. It's just you don't know what you're looking at.
Look at his last fight before the UFC. He has come so, and it's not like he's jumped to much better training circumstances. He's just very, very good at fighting and is improving rapidly.
Yeah, I mean, I saw Dean Thomas talking about this after something that I tweeted, a separate thing from what we were just talking about. And Dean Thomas said he's known Perry since he started training, and he said Perry is incredibly talented. Something to the effect of Perry is incredibly talented, and it's just instincts. Like, he's so good at making decisions in the heat of the moment. He picks up things really quickly in training. Like, he's just that kind of guy. So even in what I would consider to be a subpar training situation, he is still getting drastically better from fight to fight. But also, it's easy to forget this about Perry. He's only been a pro since 2014. He's been a pro for 3.5 years.
3 years. Like, Jesus.
It is insane to be competing at the level that he's competing at with so little experience. Like, this is partially why I'm so high on him, is that if you look at the comps, like the other guys who were competing at this level this fast in their careers, it's guys like George St. Pierre. Yeah. You know, it's like Jose Aldo didn't debut in the WEC until 5.5 years after his first pro fight. George St. Pierre was like 2 years. BJ Penn was really, really fast, but this puts him in this puts Perry in like the phenom category. Mm-hmm. The fact that he is competing at this level so quickly. Like that, the guy deserves a ton of credit for that. I think eventually he will run into a wall with his current training situation, and then we'll see, how screwed on straight is his head. Like, will he realize that he needs to make a change? I think it'll probably take a kind of a bad, inexplicable loss for that to happen. If he keeps fighting the way he's fighting right now, if he keeps making these kinds of improvements, then why would he move?
Which training situation would be worse for him? Alex Nicholson or Rick Little?
Shit.
Nothing but a sigh. That's all you got for that question. I mean, yeah, there are some questions to be asked about what exactly is the quality of Mike Perry's training. And I don't want to be one of these people who just says, oh, everyone, everyone needs to move to a big camp. Everybody needs to go to ATT as soon as I recognize. Everybody needs to go to King's MMA or whatever. In boxing, everybody needs to go to Freddie Roach. People know how this goes. But, what's the quality of training under Alex Nicholson and Alex Nicholson's dad? A man whose name I will never learn, by the way. The man I saw in that photograph with Alex Nicholson, who looked like a more muscular, 30 years older version of the same exact dude, will only ever be known as Alex Nicholson's dad by me.
I do not even want to talk about it. I blocked Alex Nicholson on Twitter because he said some horrible shit to me. I cannot overstate how little I like Alex Nicholson. And presumably Alex Nicholson's extended family. Hate to tar them with the same brush, but hey, when you associate with that dude, you deserve it. So, but
What's
I think
that say about Mike Perry, though, Pat?
I think you know exactly what that says about Mike Perry, and I think anybody who knows Mike Perry knows who Mike Perry is. So take that as you will. But this is one of those cases where, leaving aside, you have to forget some of that stuff in order to properly evaluate Perry's talent, what you're seeing in the cage, because it's easy to treat him as a joke because he's got a facial tattoo that says fucking platinum on it. It's hard to take that guy seriously, but you should take him seriously because the talent that you see in the cage, the comparisons in terms of other guys who were doing this kind of stuff at similar stages of their careers is pretty off the charts. It doesn't mean he's going to win every fight. It doesn't mean he's going to win most of his fights, but it does mean that the talent there, the potential there, really deserves to be evaluated on that basis.
Yeah, and I think that is something I would like to talk about because given the amount of talent that was evident in this fight, as it has been in basically every one of Mike Perry's UFC fights, the man needs to step back for a little while. That's my heartfelt opinion, is that you have on your hands a young and exceedingly talented fighter who has now, for his entire UFC career, except for the first one where he just got an instant knockout, has basically had nothing but wars with fighters. I mean, he's either completely overmatching somebody or he is going in there toe to toe with somebody who's just slightly better than him, largely due to experience. And the man's chin has been tested a little too much for somebody who we are talking about, somebody we're expecting to yet blossom fully. You know what I mean? I don't know.
Yeah, I think, okay, I think with a lot of fighters at this stage of their careers, they get hit a lot. Even future elite fighters do not tend to be very good defensively early in their careers. It is rare to see a young fighter who has defensive skills and talents. It takes a long time to pick them up. The difference is usually when we see young fighters at this stage of experience, even future very good ones, getting hit this much, it's on the regional scene. It's in fights that nobody remembers years after the fact.
Santiago Ponsinnibio.
Yeah. It's Jose Aldo getting lit up by Shoji Maruyama. The future greatest defensive MMA fighter of all time, by consensus, getting lit up by a Japanese journeyman.
By the consensus greatest striker of all time, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, you don't remember that stuff. Anderson Silva getting lit up in some of his early fights. Again, a future very good defensive fighter got lit up in fights by dudes he was way better than back in 2001, 2002, 2003, that stage. It takes time to get good defensively. The difference is we're just usually not seeing it on this kind of stage.
That's fair. But even when we're talking about those guys, those guys have options to stop getting lit up most of the time. That's what enables them to move forward. If you run up, this is where the intersection of Perry's training situation and his current level of competition becomes a serious problem for him, I think, because he can't adapt when somebody figures out how to get to him. So as it was for several fights on this card, low leg kicks were a big deal. Santiago Ponsinnibio's calf kicks had a great effect on Mike Perry, and he threw them because Perry was showing some unprecedented boxing defense and some nice positioning with his upper body. He was standing very heavy on his front leg as he tried to kind of bait distance and roll under shots and come back with counters. And so Ponsinnibio took advantage of the opening. After that opening was found, Perry didn't have a way to solve it.
Had no answers for it.
He had no answers for it. And that's the problem, is that once you figure out the one chink in Perry's armor, his game is still so underdeveloped because he's a 3-year novice that he can't respond. And so then he just gets lit up for the rest of the fight. And that's happened now. Like, Danny Roberts had no trouble hitting him. Alan Jouban had no trouble hitting him. And now Ponzinibbio has had no trouble hitting him. All of these guys have hit him more and more in each successive round as his fights with them have gone on. And that's some cause for concern, I think.
Yeah, I do not disagree with that at all.
Yeah. So anyway, Mike Perry looked really, really good and continues to look really good from one fight to the next. I loved the mix-ups he was doing with the left body kick to the right hand. I love the fact that he was working the body so much. Like, credit to Ponsinnibio, because the man's got a tough liver. Mike Perry was doing a great job of punishing him to the right side of his body. And yeah, I just want to see the man fulfill his potential, because I really want to see what Mike Perry is capable of. And I'm not sure we're going to get there if he's just fighting people at this level and having this kind of experience over and over. Josh Emmett knocked out Ricardo Lamas in this card, Pat. We all saw that coming. Wait,
real quick. We got to talk about the pawns, man.
Oh, okay, sure.
We only talked about Perry. We got to talk about the pawns.
You're right. This is the Perry spell overtaking me. I've already forgotten the man who just beat him because I'm so fascinated by Platinum Mike. Santiago Ponsinnibio. What do you think of his performance?
This was brilliant, man.
Hell
it would have been really, really easy for him to fall into Perry's fight and a fight in which he either would have gotten knocked out or he would have gotten so brutalized that he would have lost the decision to Mike Perry, which is crazy. But he didn't. He fought really disciplined. He fought kind of against type here. Like, Ponsinnibio is a guy who can stick and move. I mean, he's a boxer puncher, right? I think that's fairly safe to say typologically. He's a guy who really kind of wants to be in the pocket, mixing it up, picking and choosing his shots. And that means that he can box and he can pressure, but really they're only in bursts. In this fight, he did a great job of embracing the strengths of the boxer puncher archetype, where he stuck and moved when he had to. But then when he smelled blood, when he saw Perry like kind of falter, either because he knew Perry was trying to figure out what to do and just didn't have the answers for it, or Perry was hurt a little bit, Ponsinnibio swarmed him, jumped on him, landed shot after shot after shot, took advantage of the spaces where even if he wasn't going to finish the fight, he was going to put enough of a stamp on things to win a round. Like, it was a brilliant tactical and strategic performance from him that forced him to do things that he is not super comfortable doing. Like, he's not a big kicker. We don't see him throw a lot of kicks. In this fight, he was there for it. He knew that he saw Perry was leaning hard on that leg, kicked the shit out of it. Like, it was brilliant stuff that played off of the kind of, I think it showed us some of the depth of Ponsinnibio's skill sets.
Yeah, I'm actually pretty happy that we managed to point out last week that Ponsinnibio would have to change up his usual approach to beat Mike Perry, because we noted that he's done a lot of just punching people in the head, and that's what he really likes to do, is to flirt right on the end of range, and every once in a while lace in a couple of really hard 1-2s down the middle, working off that nice jab. The more time he spent purely engaging, I mean, just given the defensive improvements Mike Perry made, Santiago Ponsinnibio was hardly landing punches to the head in the first round of this fight. He was having a hard fucking time finding Mike Perry's chin, and continued to throughout the fight. It was because he was willing to have some variety to his striking that he ended up beating Mike Perry. Those low leg kicks, I think, were absolutely critical in confusing Perry's reactions and punishing him for being so hard to hit upstairs, and therefore making him easier to hit upstairs. The body work of Ponsinnibio was critical. The fact that Ponsinnibio allowed himself to unleash those puncher flurries, but spent the vast majority of the bout boxing, in a strategic sense from the outside and making Perry chase after him. He's just, as I said on Twitter just after the fight, Ponsinnibio is, for me, the perfect blend of savvy and crazy. The dude likes to throw down, but he is clearly a smart fighter who knows his business. And I appreciate where those two seemingly opposite personalities collide. I really do. I guess that's boxer puncher, right? That's it. The combination of savvy and crazy. He's got it, man.
Yeah, I mean, so how do you think he stacks up against the elite of the division? Who would you like to see him against after this?
Damn, good question. Let me pull up some rankings real quick.
Yeah.
Let me pull away from the mic while I'm doing it.
If they're not going to put, I'll tell you right off the top of my head, if they're not going to put Stephen Thompson in there with Darren Till, and who knows exactly what's going to happen there, I would love to see Till Ponsinnibio.
Yeah, somebody, I wish, man, I always do this where somebody mentions an interesting point on Twitter the day of the fight, and then I forget their name and don't have it saved. I'm going to have to get better at that. But somebody did mention that Darren Till's clinch would be a really interesting foil for Ponzinibbio's style. And I think it's because I was joking that he's like Matt Brown 2.0, but without the tie clinch. He's the technical brawler. And Darren Till's clinch was a really big part of how he managed to stymie Nicholas Dalby back in that very controversial fight that we discussed on this show. And I think it could be a really good way for him to stymie the boxing of Ponsinnibio as well. But getting him there without walking through a hail of fire in the pocket would be very interesting. Other than that, let's see. How about, honestly, at this point, like, there's not many people above Ponsinnibio that it seems like he would easily lose to. Like, how would Ponsinnibio do against Jorge Masvidal, for example?
I think they train together, but that doesn't seem to be much of a barrier for Masvidal, and I think ATT is better set up to handle that than most camps are. Yeah. Did you see that Stephen Thompson called out Dos Anjos after his win? Did he? Yeah. So, but if he can't get that, I know it's quite a jump for Ponsinnibio. Would you watch Ponsinnibio versus Stephen Thompson? Do you think he could compete with him? Yeah. I think he might be able to. I don't know. But he would still have to fight a little bit against type. Like, he couldn't just chase his head with punches, but we've seen now, like, he's capable of doing that. I don't know. I think he's I would probably pick Thompson in that fight, especially considering what he did to Masvidal. But sure. I think Ponsinnibio is way, way, way more dangerous than Masvidal is. Like, Ponsinnibio, it's easy to forget given the fact that the Pons just laced Mike Perry with a bajillion punches and didn't put him out. Ponsinnibio is a huge puncher. He is a really, really powerful puncher. He's got a lot of pop in his hands. He can put you straight to sleep. So I think if he can land on Thompson, and Thompson really depends heavily on distance, on spacing, and he will not have as much of an advantage in that realm against Ponsinnibio as he did against Masvidal. Pons is longer than Masvidal was. Mm-hmm. Then, if he gets caught and if he gets pressured, and Ponsinnibio is better at pressuring than Masvidal is, I think, then Thompson could be in real trouble. I would probably pick Thompson, but that's a really, really dangerous fight for him. Yeah, for Ponsinnibio, like, it feels like a slightly higher staked version of his fight with Nordine Taleb. Like, obviously, stylistically, Thompson's a lot different, but I think Ponsinnibio would have trouble with somebody like Thompson early. But as soon as he realized how to close the distance and how to find his angles, how to find his jab, I don't know. I think it could be a really interesting test for quite a few of these top 10 welterweights. So I'm on board, man. I've been enjoying the Pons ever since his win over my other boy. Damn it. I called him my boy, Sean Strickland. Yeah. Yeah, but since then. Anyway, all right, now on to the thing that I was so compelled to talk about. Josh Emmett. We're just going to have a few brief words on this. Josh Emmett slayed Ricardo Lamas. He slew him in the co-main event on this card. That was one of the nastier knockouts we'll see this year. We've seen a lot of nasty knockouts this year. That was a nasty, nasty knockout. Yeah, how do you think Big Fox felt about Daniel Cormier counting the number of times Ricardo Lamas' head bounced off the canvas during the replay? Probably didn't feel great about it. He probably got a little talking to after that. Well, so I was just about to put my son to bed when that happened. He was out in the living room as I watched that. And when Cormier and Anik both screamed like, wow, my son heard them and started screaming wow at the top of his lungs. An appropriate reaction. So, he chose the right time to mimic. He didn't know what he was yelling about, but I would just like to thank Anik and Cormier for teaching my son the word wow. That feels big. Great. Perfect. Josh Emmett came in 3.5 pounds overweight. He was a short notice replacement. There are a lot of factors that make me feel a little sad for Ricardo Lamas in light of this result, because the man just went from being scheduled to fight Jose Aldo to losing to short notice replacement Josh Emmett, a career lightweight. And what's Ricardo Lamas supposed to do now?
from a career perspective, because we were talking about this earlier, Ricardo Lamas' only selling point really is that he's good, is that he's a top-ranked featherweight. He is like Rafael Dos Anjos is at bantamweight. He doesn't have like a really magnetic personality. He doesn't. People don't really care about Ricardo Lamas other than the fact that you must acknowledge he's one of the 5 best featherweights in the world, and now he's not going to have that. He's going to be knocked out of the top 5, doubtlessly, because of this result. Would you be interested in seeing a rematch for this fight?
No, because there's no stakes to it, aside from the outcome, and not enough people watched this outcome to really be invested in a rematch.
Yeah.
Like,
go on.
That's kind of the problem. And this is something we'll talk a little bit more about in the third segment. But, like, for fights like this, the only stakes that are involved is you as the viewer watching it. Like, there are not a lot of people who are super invested in Josh Emmett or who are super invested in Ricardo Lamas, even though we've seen Lamas fight for years and years and years. He doesn't have, like, a huge fan base. He doesn't, there are no narratives surrounding Ricardo Lamas that a lot of people are invested in.
Right.
And so the problem that creates is when you get an outcome like this, no, there's not going to be an outpouring of grief or an outpouring of outrage that give that man his rematch when his opponent doesn't miss weight. No, because nobody cares in the long run. Like, that's hard to say, but like, we enjoy Ricardo Lamas for what we see him do in the cage. We're not invested in Ricardo Lamas's narrative arc.
Does that mean it would be fairly easy for Lamas to recover from this? Like,
yeah,
you give Lamas another fight against a top 10er and he beats them convincingly, then he's back in the mix, hopefully.
Yeah, that it goes both ways. This doesn't hurt.
Yeah. I had such strong echoes of Lennox Lewis versus Hasim Rahman watching this, where I just remembered, like, one of the reasons you can remember Lennox Lewis's career as you can is that he got to rematch Hasim Rahman and got to undo that unfortunate knockout. You know, like, just near the end of his career, he got to rematch the guy who upset him with a huge one-punch finish and got to one-punch finish him back. And it kind of made everything come together the way it was supposed to. And unfortunately, as you've said, like, Lamas isn't Lewis. He doesn't have that kind of profile. And so, I don't know. Unless Josh, but on the flip side, MMA fighters also don't tend to manage their careers that wisely. So if Lamas does ask Emmett for a rematch, what are the chances Emmett will shoot himself in the foot and accept out of a sense of honor? I could see that happening. Even though it would be much better for him probably to just let that one win over Lamas be the only encounter with Lamas on his record and move on. Anyway, that happened. Sucks for Ricardo Lamas. Big surprise from Josh Emmett. I didn't particularly see anything from Josh Emmett that looked like it was new. I think he just honestly just caught Lamas when Lamas made a bad decision in the midst of an exchange.
I don't think I realized that Emmett had that kind of pop in his hands. Even though it was like a perfect shot right on the chin, Emmett was throwing heat, and he has thrown heat before, but this looked like heat with some purpose. Like, he's getting better as a fighter. I think that if he gets a top 5 ranking out of this, that's going to seem pretty inflated pretty fast. Like, I don't know that he competes with the guys at the very top end of this division, but he's a good kind of I would describe him as a rugged fighter. Mm-hmm. You know, strong. He's pretty athletic. He's quick. He's got pop in his hands. He's a solid boxer, if not, like, I don't think a supremely technical one. He's a good wrestler. He's going to be a tough out for a lot of guys at the very top of this division. And he'll probably settle in between like 8 and 12.
Yeah, because Emmett's problem at lightweight was that he kind of, like, people kind of figure him out after the first round.
Yeah.
He has those quick hands. He has that power. He can put his combinations together, but he doesn't really, like, change his tempo or his style of attack all that much.
There's not a ton of depth to his game.
Yeah. But, you know, it's dense. There's no depth, but density, at least in his hands. We just found out. So, okay, let's take one more break. When we come back, we're going to have a little discussion about matchmaking in the UFC and how it impacts both the viewing experience and the conveyor belt of contenders towards the titles in each division after this. Financial support is fantastic, but there are other, even easier ways to support Heavy Hands. Perhaps the best is by spreading the word. We know our fan base. You're all cool, popular people with serious social media presences. You're tastemakers and trendsetters. okay, there are one or two of you that don't fit that description. You know who you are, but no matter what, you can always help us out by telling folks about the show. And you can also give us a positive rating and review on iTunes and Stitcher, things like that. We rely on word of mouth and positive feedback to grow and improve, so thank you very much for your time and your help. Now, back to the show. And we are back. Welcome back to Heavy Hands. Pat, before we move on to our third segment topic, we wanted to say a little something in memoriam of Robert Follis. We just learned very unexpectedly this week that he passed away. And I don't know, man. It hit me to hear that. Now, many people haven't heard the interview I did with Robert Follis yet, but listeners of this show will probably recall that I spoke to him just a few months ago. I can't say that I knew the guy, but he came across as a very intelligent and very caring and insightful person, and like a really cool, laid-back guy, which seems to be the consensus among everyone who ever interacted with him. And we just wanted to give a little tribute to him. Robert Follis, as a true influential part of MMA for the last several decades, is no longer with us, but he's definitely going to be missed. And
a truly great and underrated coach, somebody who deserves to be thought of in kind of the top tier all time of MMA trainers, but not somebody who ever sought out the spotlight, ever really like made a personal brand for himself. But I think at least we should recall how good he is and has been over the years. It's just, I mean, it's a tragedy, like by all accounts, just a genuinely good guy, you know?
Yeah, and has continued like from days working with Team Quest way back in the, like working with guys like Randy Couture and Matt Hamill to this day, doing tremendous things with Kevin Lee, even up to the point of his fight with Tony Ferguson. Like if you have to look for it, because Robert Follis was never seeking attention really, but if you look for the results of his work with fighters, they're there. And the thing is too, like I want to emphasize, I think this is going to come through and be emphasized by many other people in light of Robert's passing, but he really did have an impact on his fighters personally that I think can't be understated. This was a guy who really cared about not just his fighters becoming better fighters, but becoming better people, and that's really, really rare among trainers, a lot of whom are just, manipulators and people who take advantage of their wards. So Robert Follis will be dearly missed, and our condolences, seriously, heartfelt condolences from us at Heavy Hands to anybody who was close to Robert and all those affected by this. So we wanted to talk about matchmaking, Pat. And how did we get here? That's the question. How did we arrive at the point where we decided to end the show by talking about matchmaking? Well, we were looking at next week's card, weren't we? And we were looking at UFC 219 and thinking, can we talk about any of these fights in advance of next week's card? Which ones, other than the big name fights, really stand out as ones that we have to talk about? And when the answer to that question was not many of them. Why is that?
It's because we hit on, I think, kind of the essential fact of the UFC in the Sean Shelby McMaynard era, which is that they are doing, in objective terms, a great job of putting fights together. Basically, every fight serves a purpose. It's a competitive stylistic matchup. It's guaranteed to produce action. They're matching up prospects with guys who are going to test them in specific ways. They're matching up kind of journeymen with each other in fights that are going to produce a compelling fight and probably a finish. It is really good matchmaking. But what it lacks is stakes, for the most part. Like you need to be real deep and invested in this world to find meaning in these fights.
Yeah, this is what I have come to understand as the vivisection experience. And I'm not talking about being cut apart as a living test subject, but rather the MMA vivisection we do over on Bloody Elbow. There have been many cards where, Pat, you and I will get together to do Heavy Hands, and there will be only a few fights that we want to talk about. And then I have to research the full card to do the vivisection. And I usually find myself liking the look of a card much better when it of the full card, much better when it comes time to do the vivisection than when it's time to do heavy hands. And the difference is that you have to research these fights to really get invested in them. Like, the only way to get hooked, the only way to buy into the narrative is to do some personal digging and dive into the histories of these fighters and the stylistic matchups. And it's just not accessible to, like, I don't know, the animal part of your brain that just wants to see two names and get instantly excited by it. Like, when I see Nurmagomedov versus Barboza, it's not just because they're tremendously skilled fighters. I'm instantly excited about that matchup. It has weight. It has drawing power. When I see Miles Jury versus Rick Glenn, I know it's a good fight, but, what's the difference? It's not one that I feel I have to talk about on this week's Heavy Hands.
Yeah, that's kind of it. That's kind of it. I mean, it's getting harder for me, at least at this point, to be invested in this huge array of basic, what amounts to content that we're being fed by the UFC. Like, because you start to understand that the product is just kind of nameless violence. That's what we're getting is high quality violence. Like, if you enjoy watching skilled violence, you're going to get really good, skillful violence practically every weekend. And you're probably going to enjoy the experience of it. And I find myself, as I watch the UFC nowadays, I enjoy pretty much every fight that I end up watching. Mm-hmm. But for me, I don't feel like I have to catch everything because I'm not invested in it. Yeah. Right. Like, I'm not going to be invested in these lower level fights. We're seeing a sport that's evolved. The upshot to this is that it's evolving the sport very quickly. Fighters are trying new things. Coaches are trying new things. They're getting lots of practice. Like, this is a huge crucible in which there's a lot of incentive for innovation. So that's more or less what we're seeing. But at the end of the day, for the consumer, the product is not necessarily incredibly compelling, except for what it represents in exactly the moment that you're watching it, which is skillful violence.
Yeah. How much of that evolution is like, little fishes evolving in a cave where there's all this rapid growth and diversity, and we see all these amazing developments, but very separate from the world outside. Like, as the sport is evolving, the UFC is also experiencing a very bad year. Many people probably already know this, but they're having a hard time getting people to fucking care because they only have a couple stars. And I don't know. Let's talk about why that is. Why do certain fights just not have weight? Does the UFC just not have enough fighters with weight to their names? Because that seems like part of the problem. We have increasingly seen that the pool of guys that fans care about is restricted. Yeah. Like, the pool has gotten smaller and smaller. And this is something that we've talked about, not really on this show, but in other venues. I've written a lot about this. Is the middle class of UFC draws more or less doesn't exist anymore. Like, when the UFC was at its peak on pay TV in 2009, 2010, 2011, there was a huge, like, almost like a middle class of draws who could still pull big number, like what would be by today's standards, really big numbers on pay-per-view. Guys like BJ Penn, even Rich Franklin would do like 300,000 pay-per-view buys, that middle class of draws doesn't really exist anymore. You have the mega draws like Conor McGregor, Ronda Rousey. Then you have very, very still high level draws like John Jones in a rivalry matchup, or George St. Pierre, who just returned. But between them and the guys that nobody really cares about, the fighters who are doing 100,000 or 200,000 pay-per-view buys, like TJ Dillashaw, Demetrius Johnson, there really is not that middle class. It's like Stipe Miocic is the middle class of pay-per-view draws. You can do 300,000 or 350,000 buys, and that's it. Like, and in terms of TV draws, there really isn't. It's hard to find fighters who are going to make a compelling case to viewers that they have to watch. Rafael Dos Anjos has had 4 fights on UFC on Fox now, and from what I'm hearing, early reports are saying this card didn't draw that well. Not when people watch this Fox card, and Dos Anjos has had a very credible record as a Fox main eventer.
Robbie Lawler.
Robbie fucking Lawler was fighting.
Robbie Lawler has had Dos Anjos hasn't been on Fox that many times. Dos Anjos was there for the Nate Diaz fight. That's the only other time he's fought on Fox, isn't it?
I believe he fought Khabib on Fox and lost, and then I think he fought Nate.
Yeah, but that was a prelim fight.
And then that was not on a main card. The Cerrone rematch was also
You're right. You're absolutely right. Sorry.
Yeah, the title defense against Cerrone.
You were stone correct.
So, but like that seems like it would be pretty compelling. Why don't people care about Rafael Dos Anjos? Is it the UFC's fault? Like what can the
What's
UFC...
the story? It's a story thing. You have to invest people in a narrative. That's the challenge. And it's really hard to do that if you're the UFC, if you're putting on 40 shows a year. If you're putting on a dozen pay-per-views and 4 Fox shows, that's 16 big fights. That's 16 big cards a year that you have to deal with. How are you going to do that? With what army are they going to put together compelling narratives to package and sell to fans through what venues over the course of a year? So you're doing that you're doing that basically 1.3 fights per month that you have to really invest people in.
Yeah,
1.3 cards per month. Like they don't have an army of people to do that.
They have. Probably, from what I've heard, the opposite of an army of people who actually like work on UFC posters and marketing. Like it's a surprisingly small crew at UFC HQ, from what I've heard.
Yeah, it's tiny. Like and that's when you start to realize that they're not really trying to do that. If they wanted to do that, they could. They would hire more people. They would come up with dedicated strategies for how to sell every individual champion. They would have somebody whose job would just be to go through the roster and pick out the most promising fighters, like an array of most promising fighters, and work to try to get to pitch them out. Like if that's what they were trying to do, then they would have somebody doing that, but they're not.
Because all this matchmaking discussion is an update of the oversaturation question. The original oversaturation. Did I call it oversaturation? I believe I did.
You did, yes.
The original. Thank you for not pointing that out until I brought it back up myself. The original oversaturation issue that started to become like a big topic of conversation among fight fans in 2012 or so, when the UFC really started cranking up the number of shows they did every year. Their interest seems to be in the UFC over the fighters. And the question is, how long can they keep favoring the brand over the fighters that actually sell the fights without destroying the company? Like without getting to such a point where just nobody cares about any of these fights, and now it turns out you're dead because Conor McGregor doesn't feel like fighting anymore. So who do you have?
Well, that's kind of that's the big picture question: is how much is nameless, faceless violence that is compelling, that is skillfully executed? How much is that worth? Are you what the UFC is selling is quantity and low cost of programming, and hoping that that's going to be worth a big chunk of money on their next TV deal.
Yeah.
As it turns out, the ratings are declining. Ratings have gone down pretty substantially this year. As it turns out, you actually do need to have people that fans care about above a certain baseline that they care enough about to tune in. So that's kind of the challenge. That's what they're going to need to figure out as they're in the process of trying to sign a new TV deal. They need to have fighters that people give a shit about. I think there are plenty of candidates out there,
sure,
but they're going to have to invest at some point. I literally just wrote a piece on this for Deadspin a few weeks ago, but it's like, you can't expect to catch lightning in a bottle. It's that you have to have an apparatus where you're pushing fighters all the time as much as humanly possible, and then you hope that one of them hits. Yeah. You hope that for whatever reason people connect to Platinum Mike Perry or Santiago Ponzinibbio or Dos Anjos or whoever, and you hope. But the only way that happens is if you constantly put them out there. That's the prerequisite, is constantly putting them out there. It's not that like viral stardom is not really a thing. It's not like one thing happens and it makes that person a star. You have to put them out there over and over and over again, and then hope that one of those moments goes viral.
Sure. If
that's your model. And I don't even think that that's the best model for how combat sports stardom works. But
Yeah. So let's bring into the discussion for some specific examples. Let's bring in something that happened fairly recently that there were two interesting sides to this discussion. George St. Pierre took the middleweight title from Michael Bisping, which most MMA fans, I think, were happy about because Michael Bisping had, in the minds of many, been holding up the division, had just been pursuing like money fights against contenders that weren't really contenders when he had some very qualified contenders waiting in the wings. That kind of thing does strike me as something that could really hurt a division long term. Letting George St. Pierre come in and fight Michael Bisping, yeah, I get it. You have two big names, and currently you are really hurting for big names. You need matchups like this to try to sell fights to people. But now that GSP has relinquished the middleweight belt, how are you supposed to get people excited about Robert Whittaker, who is the guy that I think you should really be invested in making people interested in, because he looks like he's cut out to be at the top of this division for a long time. So now Robert Whittaker has how much better would it have been for the division, right? And for the future of the UFC long term, if Robert Whittaker had gotten to take the middleweight title from either George St. Pierre or Michael Bisping?
Would have been way better. But you have to understand, like, this choice was made years ago. They can't go back now. You can't just hit a reset button.
You think this is fully like a calculated long-term decision?
I don't think it's calculated, but I think that the die has been cast. I think that it starts innocently enough, and the UFC has always put on matchups for weird reasons. But it's like they've always been willing to do things to step outside the box to try and draw. So Couture versus James Toney,
sure.
Royce Gracie versus Matt Hughes. Like, they've always put on fights like this. Even CM Punk, the signing was not at all out of the ordinary for things that we can expect from the UFC.
Oh, CM Punk was just a much worse Brock Lesnar.
Mm-hmm. But when you give Frankie Edgar a title shot coming off 2 losses at featherweight, when you give Nick Diaz a title shot coming off a loss, like, then that starts to send a message that your belts are not actually worth as much as you said they were worth. And so but those are decisions that they've made over the course of years. They're the ones who have made the decisions to devalue their belts. Like, and if other people start devaluing the belts too, well, like, they're just following the UFC's lead.
Do you think that has a lot to do with this? Is that the titles, like, people just don't give a shit about the titles anymore?
Yeah, it's a promotional tool. And, like, it was always a promotional tool, but a promotional tool can have particular meanings and valences among fans that go beyond, like, oh, this is just a hunk of metal that we're using to promote a fight. Like, and the UFC title used to have that kind of value to it. And now I just think it increasingly doesn't. Like, if there are a bajillion interim titles, if you're going to use a belt to promote a particular fight, if you feel like a pay-per-view has to have a belt, so you create an interim title out of nowhere. Like, remember, like, the featherweight situation last year?
Of course,
they created basically an interim title in order to have a title fight at the top of that Pettis Holloway card. Like,
the fact that Pettis Holloway was an interim title fight should still be infuriating to at least a minority of MMA fans, because there was no reason for a belt to have been on the line between those two, other than just the. But that's the thing, is that, like, a belt's already a promotional tool. Does it hurt the promotional ability of a belt to so flagrantly manipulate who has the belt? I think it does. I think this has something to do too with the fact that we're in the era of, like, the super fight. Every single champion now, they get their belt, and what's the first thing they do? Is they chase a super fight with another champion, because that's the only value that belts have anymore. It just signifies that you're the best at one weight, so you can fight the best at another weight. And fewer and fewer champions seem invested in defending their belts against what should be like a ranked conveyor belt of contenders moving towards them, because I think they're smart. They're savvy. They recognize that in the UFC now, there's no value in that. The only way they can build their brands, like Tyron Woodley would have been better off if he'd been able to fight Nick Diaz than what did happen with him fighting Damian Maia. I understand. Go on.
These are mutually reinforcing strands.
Right.
Like as the UFC loses its draws, and increasingly you have fewer and fewer people who can pull money, as the titles are devalued, as your baseline audience slips lower, as your fans are less willing to plop down $60 to pay for a pay-per-view, all of which is stuff that's happened, then your champions are not idiots. Like they understand that if the belt is devalued, if if like just having a welterweight title fight is not a thing that gets people's blood up anymore, then why would you just like be content to fight a conveyor belt of guys?
Yeah.
Unless that's going to be your brand. If your brand is just going to be, I beat all comers all the time. And increasingly, I think that's kind of working for Demetrius Johnson.
Sure. But it is a much harder brand to maintain than I won the title. Now I'm going to get a money fight. Like,
yeah. I mean, it works for Max Holloway because Holloway's already beaten all those guys.
Yeah, it works. Yeah, it works for Holloway and Johnson because like they're incredibly fucking good. Like, and incredibly versatile, and can seemingly not, the vast majority of UFC fighters can't do whatever they want to any opponent they're put against. Like most people just can't, there is no achievable way for them to make that kind of brand a reality. So the rest of them are left with, either being put together in matchups that are very competitive, but how much does a matchup like Miles Jury versus Rick Glenn even mean? Like, we're going to see a good fight, but these fighters must know at this point that these good matchups, all it means is they are fighting harder opposition for less reward, because the chances of them gaining enough traction to be vaulted into a title shot are less than ever before. But the matchmaking is so good that they're still being put in against tough opponents every single time out. So what I think this is going to presage is right around the corner, MMA is going to start to look a lot more like pro boxing. Depending on what happens to the UFC in the future, I think we're going to start to see a lot more in like padded records. People realizing that all that really matters is the payoff at the top, and that you just have to sort of fake your way through the nobody can beat me phase early in your career until you can get that check. I really think that's what we're going to see relatively soon.
Yeah, it's entirely possible.
Because what's the logical response to this otherwise?
The logical response to this otherwise is it's to try to find some way to make yourself stand out from the crowd, which basically it's going to require fighters to be self-promoters.
Yeah.
Because the UFC, frankly, at this point is not going to do it. So you need to find ways to stand out. You need to find alternative ways of kind of building a brand and bringing an audience with you.
But what's a tried and true way of standing out is, hey, I'm undefeated.
I don't think that really has that much cachet in MMA, frankly. I think that it would require a kind of it took a long time for I'm undefeated to be a huge selling point in boxing.
True.
Like that, it took a generation, and frankly Mayweather, for that to be the be all end all thing.
But MMA as a sport has the benefit of having existed after the time of boxing. Like the lessons are learned for combat athletes, I think. I don't know. I just think the opportunity is there for us to start seeing like fewer and fewer really compelling high level fights, because there's no reason for fighters to continue accepting these really well made matchups if they're not going to be either financially or not going to be rewarded for it financially or in terms of their legacy. Just nobody cares. So I don't know. I find it hard to imagine this sort of environment existing in 5 years from now, in such a world that fighters are not actively avoiding difficult fights until they can get to the ones that really pay. Because why would they? I don't know.
Yeah.
Oh, what are we going to do with this show when the sport collapses, Pat? What are we going to do?
Well, but see, I mean, here's the thing is like, what we're talking about here is largely not for us, because we will still tune in to watch that skillful violence because it's still interesting.
The fights are still good.
Yeah, that's the thing is like, the fights are good. The fights like they are compelling matchups. It's just like it would be nice if there were more ways of creating a little more oomph at the top, both because those are the great fights that are really worth writing and talking about, are the ones that have some narrative juice to them. Mm-hmm. It would be great if the UFC was better at telling us that. Like this Cyborg Holm fight, for example, these are great narratives. Holly Holm has a chance to be a 2-division champion. Even if her recent run since the Rousey fight has not been great, like this is a huge shot at redemption for her. It can show that she's not like a fluke with that Rousey knockout, that she belongs to be among the greatest women's combat athletes of all time. And for Cyborg, this is her prove it moment. This is her first huge matchup with somebody, frankly, who belongs on her level in a very long time. So like, if we believe in Cyborg, if we believe in Holly Holm, like this is a story right here. This is a huge and compelling story. But how is the UFC able to put it in those terms? Is the UFC able to convince us of that? Are they going to be able to make us tune in? I guess is the question.
I have yet to see any particularly compelling illustrations of that kind of narrative from the UFC. So
yeah. So I don't know. So I guess what I'm saying is UFC, hire me to write those narratives for you.
Yeah, right. Honestly, like UFC hire this person is said way too often online. Anytime somebody puts out a good promo, somebody makes a good fan poster analysis, people are like, hire this person, UFC. That is evidence that you're doing something wrong. Like people all over the place are identifying problems in your production. Oh, sort it out, please. Okay. Give me a reason to care about these fights, because I really want to, because I enjoy the fights, but I still need more. I still need more to continue tuning in every single week for this shit. So that's it. That's matchmaking. Credit once again, as we've said many times, to Mick Maynard and Sean Shelby. They are doing fantastic work, but honestly, I don't think the promotion is there to back them up, and it may be a question of who will essentially betray them first, the fighters they're making matches for, or the promotion who hires them to do so. But their matchmaking is good. That's that much we can say once again. And that about does it for this week's episode of Heavy Hands. We really appreciate all of you tuning in, and we hope you enjoyed the show. Before we head out, let's let you know what we have coming out this week. I'll go first because there's not going to be much on this end. I have some things in the works, but I don't want to spill the beans just yet. So I need to figure out what's actually going to be feasible before I do that. So just keep your eyes peeled. Pat, what about you? Some Tides of History stuff this week?
Yeah, I have something a little bit different on Tides of History. I interviewed the actor Gary Oldman and the writer of the movie Darkest Hour. It's about Winston Churchill and kind of the worst days of the beginning of World War II, like leading up to the evacuation of Dunkirk. So I got to talk to them about making historical fiction, about how you bring a historical character to life. What sources do you use? What kind of obligations do you have to historical reality? It was interesting. It was fun to talk to them. Gary Oldman is the most famous person I've ever talked to, probably. But he was charming and wonderful. And so I think it's different than the stuff I normally do, but I hope that the listeners enjoy it. So check that out. Otherwise, that's about it.
Did Gary Oldman show up to the interview dressed as his character from True Romance?
It was a phone interview. I have no idea what he was wearing.
So I'm going to imagine that, yes, he was rocking some serious old man white guy dreads during the entirety of the interview. And that should give you even more reason to check that out if you weren't already enticed enough. Thank you once again, guys, for listening. Make sure to check out our work and find us on social media if you have questions, concerns, or you just want to follow us and see all the very interesting things we like to talk about. You can find us both on Twitter. I am at BoxingBush, that's BUSCH, and you can find Pat at Patrick_Wyman. You can also find the both of us on Facebook.com/either Patrick Wyman MMA or Connor Ruebusch MMA. And hey, since we have you listening to this show, please give us a little rating on iTunes. Share us with your friends, and if you are not already, there are many, many ways to subscribe so that you don't have to go hunting down each weekly episode of Heavy Hands. You can subscribe to the feed via iTunes, via the Google Play Store, via Stitcher, or also just via our RSS feed at heavyhands.libsyn.com. So make sure you check out all those methods. Stay plugged in to get all the episodes without needing to find them. And that's about it. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Once again, I'm doing the thing where I continue to drag on, so now it's time to say the last line of the episode. If you came here today for the finer points of face punching, you came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands.